Alright, let me set the scene. It's April in the year 2003. I was 17 years old, worked at a Burger King where my mom was the manager, and I had very little money. One particular night at midnight, I drove to my local big box store. It was Walmart. I didn't want to admit it, but alright. I was there at midnight because the newest Final Fantasy game, a collection of the first 2 games, one of which was never released in the US, was coming out and I needed it. It was called Final Fantasy Origins. I ended up pronouncing it as Final Fantasy Oranges, but like fake nails, we press on. For some context, collectively we learned that the Final Fantasy II that we all learned was not actually Final Fantasy II. It was actually Final Fantasy IV. This was still kinda new to me at the time. So when the magazine EGM, or Electronic Gaming Monthly, showed some screenshots from the then unreleased Final Fantasy game, I knew I had to have it. I walked up to the game case and it hadn't been stocked yet. I quickly ran and flagged someone down, and they didn't have keys to the case, but they knew someone who did. I told them which game I wanted, and it was like I was speaking a totally different language until they finally brought out a whole stack of games released that day. I bought it along with the strategy guide and quickly got back home where I popped it into my PS2 and I started playing Final Fantasy I first. When I got to Final Fantasy II, I was... how do I put this? Horrendously let down is maybe a little strong, but it's suitable. My jaw dropped. I tried to justify it by saying things like, well, that's how it works in real life, I guess. Alright, let me explain for those of you who are maybe a little afraid to play it. The gameplay of Final Fantasy II is unique. There are no experience points and no levels. If you want more HP for your party members, they have to lose a lot in battle. If you want your character's strength to increase, you gotta fight a lot using weapons or fists if you want to be overpowered. And each type of weapon that you use, whether it's a sword or bow or your fists, they get stronger the more you use them. If you want your magic to be stronger, you use that particular spell a lot in battle. There's so much micromanaging, stats, and attributes that even battling and leveling up becomes an extremely tedious process. You thought normal grinding was bad?
Honey, you've got a big storm coming.
The thing is, I wanted to love this game. I knew it was an early Final Fantasy game, so I mean, it's not like I expected some unreleased masterpiece, but this? I didn't ask for this. As time went on and Final Fantasy II was released again in the form of Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls for the Game Boy Advance, I knew I had to trudge through the game again. And I did. And I still didn't like it. And then it was released yet again for PSP. I couldn't bring myself to even start a file. It just sat there for years until I started filming myself throwing it away for 2 videos. Make it 3! I dropped it on the ground. All right. And now we're here with the Pixel Remaster of it available, and I thought maybe it would be a good idea to revisit it yet again and find some good points. I found that the story of the game is fairly solid. It's your standard Final Fantasy fare with rebels and an evil empire and all that jazz. This was the game that began to have characters with some depth. And some death. A few characters die in this game, and it's a story point they've used a lot ever since. Also, another thing that gets used quite a bit that originated with Final Fantasy II is our lovable bird creature, the Chocobo. Also, Moogles were invented for this game, but they were scrapped and they used beavers in its place. Moogles are way better. There's a bit of drama in Final Fantasy II and it's pretty good. But I think the main thing to take away from this game is the soundtrack. I love this soundtrack. Listening to the world map music, instead of being upbeat and heroic sounding, it sounds beat down, worn out. Kinda sad if I'm being honest. Lots of minor chords and sadness, but the battle theme? Let's check it out. More so than the game before it, this battle theme absolutely has the standard Nobuo touches that make his music great. You can tell it's his work when listening to it retroactively. Of course, every song from the game is just brilliant, but other than that, is there anything else in the game that makes it any better than how it's currently described? Is there some shred of something amazing that is hidden away in the game that we just largely ignore? Other than the story and soundtrack, not really. I mean, it's got a word memorization system, so that's neat. In fact, earlier I mentioned I was gonna go revisit the game again to find some good points, but as you can see here, I've hardly even touched it. I know I will at some point go back through the game and get all the Steam achievements, and maybe then I'll find something amazing about it. But I just don't see that happening. But here's the thing about Final Fantasy II. It's not a bad game. Not at all. It's an ungraceful game. It's kind of like a giraffe that's just been born, wobbly and doesn't quite have the coordination to run in stride next to its parents. Or parent. In this particular case. The series was still very young at the time, and if you look at other games that were from the time period, the second one is always the experimental one. Zelda 2, Castlevania 2, they all tried something different, and I love that they tried those things, But for Final Fantasy II, it just didn't pan out very well. I honestly think every fan of the Final Fantasy series should at least give this game an honest shot. Maybe you'll love it, and it will show that our preferences are just different. But if you don't want to spend the money on something you might hate and think that some of these games are just a cash grab, and I totally understand that, then you're not going to want to ignore this video I did on the Pixel Remasters being a cash grab. I definitely get heated and go on a rant on this video, and I may or may not have called somebody out in it. Whoops, sorry.